An El Nino is a process in which much of the Pacific Ocean's trade winds weaken to allow for considerable warming across the eastern half of the ocean. In this part, called the ENSO region, the water temperatures have been absolutely surging throughout much of 2026, to the point where the anomalies are surging past 3.5 degrees Celsius above average. That is what we would consider a super El Nino taking place. And a super El Nino has been bringing a lot of big impacts to our weather across much of the northern hemisphere. In Europe, major heat waves have been going on across much of the continent. Across the Atlantic Ocean, our hurricane season remains somewhat inactive. And across much of the United States, our weather definitely has been impacted. However, things are only going to get worse from here, as in today's video, we're going to be diving in depth as to just how bad things might get as this super El Nino continues to take place, whether you're in the Atlantic, whether you're in the tropics, or whether you're in the continental United States, especially going into the winter of 2026. And in today's video, we're going to be breaking down the effects of El Nino in all of these regions. Ladies and gentlemen, let's dive right into it. So here's the situation we have for you right here. We're going to be talking about El Nino. We're going to spend the first few minutes discussing that and the latest updates, and then we're going to pivot and discuss the potential impacts it's going to have on both the hurricane season and potentially winter weather across much of the United States. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and dive right into the El Nino analysis, and then we're going to talk about the weather conditions. So starting off right here, I have the region 1 and 2 index opened up from Cyclonic WX. This is regions 1 and 2, which is off the coast of Peru and other areas of South America. This is also the region that's closest to the Galapagos Islands as well. And based on what we've seen over the last few months, the water temperatures have absolutely been spiking. We're getting to a point where we went from around 1 degree Celsius above average to almost 4 degrees Celsius above average in the span of about 90 days. And taking a quick gander at all of this going forward, this is almost 4x to the amount of water temperatures that we had seen previously in terms of an anomaly standpoint right here. And as time continues to progress, it looks to me that things are only going to continue to increase as we've seen more and more of the warm water from below the thermocline start to upwell and potentially impact those areas. Although I will say it has kind of slowed down compared to what we've seen previously. It did dull out for a little bit in June, then it ramped back up towards the middle of June, then it stalled back out and slowly increased, and now we're at a point where it's going up and down a little bit more as well. Although the trend is still up, you are seeing some pretty significant swings. They are starting to stagnate a little bit, especially as we've seen in the last week or so, but overall, this right here is most likely going to be temporary. We'll have to wait and see how things pan out, but that's regions 1 and 2. Let's go ahead and switch over to regions 3 and 4. Regions 3 and 4 is a little bit of a different story. You had it kind of stalling out through around 0.5 to 1 degree Celsius throughout May, only starting to increase by the time we got to the last week of May or so, and it really started to surge up going into June. An absolute spike by early June, getting close to 1.5 degrees Celsius above average, and then it's just gradually been increasing. It started to kind of stall out a little bit in late June, and then in July things started ramping up, and we're kind of in that still increasing but kind of going up and down in terms of that stagnation process once again. But the latest value is about 2.7 degrees Celsius above average, 2.17 degrees Celsius rather above average in that region, which that is pretty considerable. And when you look at both those regions together, you have a pretty significant situation where you're looking at already pretty much super El Nino territory based on what we're seeing with the anomalies and how things are progressing. And with that being said, I also want to go ahead and show the thermocline just to show you just how things have ramped up and how things are continuing to start increasing going forward. This is the thermocline right here over the last couple of weeks, and taking a look at our ENSO region, you're looking at around almost 9 degrees Celsius above average, particularly further to the west, around 100 to 150 meters below sea level. And you're also seeing a lot of these water temperatures starting to really peak up and ramp up across much of the regions 1 and 2 areas over here. Things have started to ramp up. You're starting to see these water temperatures continuing to increase. Also noticing a little bit of subtle warming a bit further down into parts of the water, around 300 to 400 meters. It's not really that much, maybe by about a half a degree above average or more in terms of the anomalies. That's kind of typical right there, but something to watch for as well with this El Nino, because we were talking about this and we're looking at all these values, at least on the surface and at least where this thermocline is, this is pretty considerable. But as time continues to progress and as we continue to move forward, you're starting to notice, at least especially in the western part of the ENSO region, you're noticing those below average anomalies starting to creep up over there, and they're arguably getting stronger, albeit they are kind of getting all over the place over here around 400 meters below. We are seeing a bit of strengthening with those colder anomalies further to the west, near the Papua New Guinea and other areas in in Oceania as well. So you're going to want to watch out for this, because this is, from what I've seen, is what's going to set up our El Nino collapsing going into early next year. And as time progresses, as we continue to look at this thermocline, there are a few main questions that we need to kind of explore with this in a future video. And the first question is all of this heat going to come up to the surface all at once, or is it going to come up at all at this current point? And from what I've seen, it's definitely creeping up. But the main question I'm going to have is how much is going to come to the surface, because we're seeing that starting to increase more and more as time progresses, albeit the bulk of it still remains below the surface. And as more upwelling takes place, and as we see those trade winds continuing to weaken in that part of the Pacific, you're seeing more of those waters starting to ramp up and push further to the west as well. The main question is that western side of the thermocline that's really been heating up over the last little while, is that going to come up to the surface? And if it does, that those 9 degrees Celsius average anomalies would absolutely crush whatever record the ENSO region possessed previously. The answer, I would say, to that is probably not, but I wouldn't rule out maybe a good 4 to 5 degrees Celsius anomalies creeping up in that region as well. We're already starting to see that in parts of the ENSO region a bit further to the east near Peru, Ecuador, and the Galapagos Islands. But overall, mainly looking at the thermocline, things are definitely getting interesting for sure, and it kind of gives you an idea of how things are going to set up going into late 2026 and early 2027, because you are starting to see the signs that this ENSO region is going to start transitioning from El Nino to La Nina next year, as you're seeing the strengthening cold anomalies below further to the west. Those are most likely going to carry over to the east. You have this region right here, right off the coast of South America, that's kind of been persistent, albeit I'm not as concerned with that. That to me is more so noise than anything. But overall, things are starting to ramp up across much of the ENSO region. Now we go ahead and go to our main question: how is this going to affect our weather? And let's go ahead and get started with that section. So this is what we have for you guys right here. This is the CFS climate model I have pulled up to show you what this ENSO region is going to do. But here's what we have for our precip. I want to first take a gander, and I first want to take a look at our main sea level pressure anomalies, just to kind of give you an idea and to start running the table a little bit. As we're going into August, a big reason for this for an inactive hurricane season that we're noticing with this is you're seeing higher pressures across much of the tropics than average. Higher pressures typically mean less convection, less thunderstorm activity, less organized thunderstorm activity, you name it right there. What you're also seeing is you're seeing those below average anomalies in the eastern Pacific, which is only going to increase your tropical activity in that area as well. And part of the reason for that is because you have strengthening of trade winds across much of the Atlantic Ocean. The trade winds weaken in the Pacific, which is what allows for an active Eastern Pacific season over there. But you're definitely noticing your higher pressures going into August. September gets a little bit more mixed. Things get a bit more interesting, especially for your potential homegrown storms across parts of the southeastern United States. Main development region kind of dips to around just above or around average. Same thing with the Caribbean as well. So things start to get a little interesting there. But look at October, ladies and gentlemen. This is a pretty significant switch flipped right here, and this is right about when El Nino is peaking. So this is an intriguing thing that we're going to want to watch out for. It seems to me that what El Nino is going to do is, at least for the pressures right here, you're going to see maybe more convection, stronger thunderstorms, at least stronger activity across much of the Atlantic as we go towards late September and going into early October. And you might have a situation where, because the El Nino is causing all the dry air and the shear and all that stuff right now, I'm going to have to look at all the other factors from this, but based on low pressure alone, things might get a little interesting on the backside of hurricane season, especially going into September and October. Based on what I'm seeing with this data, there's about a 6-week period in which where things might start to switch and things might get a little interesting. How interesting? I'm not 100% sure. Then as we go into November, season starts to shut down across much of the main development region. The only stuff that we might see is homegrown stuff once again, but at this current point in time, as it gets to November, that's when hurricane season's pretty much done. So I'm not too convinced that much is going to happen. But watch late September into October as we start looking at other factors into this as well. Let's look at our sea surface temperature anomalies. This isn't really paying too much attention to what's going on with the ENSO region. I'm just looking at this to see what the trends are going to look like, especially if we see a weak hurricane season based on the trade winds and the shear and all of that as well. Going into August, you're definitely seeing the MDR continuing to heat up, about average across much of the main development region north of this period of heating. Caribbean starts heating up as well, so you're going to want to pay attention to this as time continues to progress. But September is when we start seeing that switch where you're seeing increased water temperature surges. In terms of your anomalies, this is when around your water temperatures are pretty much at their peaks and they start to decline going into later parts of the season. What this is telling me is maybe that decline is a little bit slower than what we would originally think, partly due to the fact that we're not going to be seeing as much of an active season. The Caribbean's still a bit scattered and all over the place at this current point in time. Going into October, that kind of persists as well. You're seeing those anomalies really starting to increase across much of the Atlantic as well, in part due to a weak hurricane season and the fact that there's not too much tropical cyclones that are going to be generating enough ACE and generating enough upwelling to really keep these waters cool. So that's kind of an interesting feature and an interesting thing we're looking at, and that continues to persist going into November and December of 2026. So just wanted to make that quick side note. Let's go ahead and take a quick gander at our shear anomalies. Looking at our shear anomalies going to August, as you can see, not too much shear for any homegrown systems across much of the United States, and especially the southeastern and the Gulf Coast over here, just like what we saw with Bertha not too long ago. But in the Caribbean and in the main development region, with the exception of this area further to the south of the Cabo Verde Islands, there is considerably stronger shear than average across much of this area going into August. Although just areas further to the north and the subtropics are a bit below that, so definitely something you're going to want to keep in mind. Going into September, that kind of persists as well across much of the main development region. This shear pocket actually shifts a bit further to the east. It's not as excessive and it does start to break down a little bit, but by and large, you're still looking at a more homegrown favored system. It's not necessarily saying that tropical development isn't going to happen in the main development region. It definitely can, but it makes it a lot more difficult, especially in the central part of it. So if a tropical wave emerges off the coast of Africa, it'll need to get through that central part before moving into weaker shear anomalies throughout September, whether it's in the Atlantic Basin or in the Gulf before things start to get their act together. So it's definitely an interesting situation that we're going to want to pay attention to. October across much of the tropics, though, with the exception of potential homegrown systems across parts of Florida and the other parts of the southeastern United States, you're seeing a lot more shear across much of the main development region. So it makes things a lot more difficult to develop, and hence why we're seeing the low numbers with the potential hurricane season in 2026, because what El Nino does in the Atlantic, and what I'm showing you with this, is it strengthens the trade winds across much of the Atlantic. Hence, across the tropics, you're seeing more wind shear, and why you're not seeing as much of a decline as what we've seen previously. So that's kind of what we're seeing throughout October. Going into November, though, it does start to switch up a little bit as winter weather starts to ramp up across much of the United States. We will get to that in a second. But overall, things are getting interesting over here, especially in parts of Texas and parts of the southeastern U.S. as well. But in the tropics, things remain pretty sheery with the exception of areas in the Canary Islands over here. So that's what we're looking at for our shear. And lastly, let's take a look at our moisture component with all of this. And looking at our moisture component, another thing that we have been watching for as well is the Sahara air layer. The Sahara air layer has been pounding much of the main development region throughout the first couple of months of the season so far. And as time continues to progress going into August, it looks like that trend is going to continue. Although the southernmost dry anomalies are right here, at least the most words, are the furthest to the south, whereas areas further over here across parts of the Caribbean and parts of the main development region are not as bad, although they are still pretty dry compared to what we're seeing with the climatological mean. Going into September, things are not too much better across the MDR. The dry air does decrease by a pretty significant amount, but in areas like the Gulf and areas in the Atlantic Basin over here is where you're going to see your higher moisture anomalies. And then going into October, things do get a little bit dicey across the MDR and pretty much a little bit of everywhere outside of the Caribbean, for a matter of fact, with the exception of a couple spots like areas in the but rather the Eastern Caribbean over here off the coast of Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic in this slight area right here. And then going into November, as we start to flip towards winter weather season, you're starting to see more of those moisture anomalies across much of the United States. We'll talk about that in just a second. And less so in the tropics. So based on what we're seeing with this super El Nino that's currently progressing, it's definitely doing three things. Number one, you are seeing a bit of a switch with the pressures going into September and October. So you might see some more convection, you might see some more storm potential throughout the hurricane season at large. But in terms of tropical development, the wind shear and the dry air definitely are inhibiting things going forward, albeit the stability issues that we noticed from last year aren't as big of a factor. It's going to take a lot more for Cape Verde setups to really ramp up, albeit your homegrown systems definitely are going to be a bit more favorable this year than what we've seen in years past. I mean, we already saw a couple of tropical storms in the Gulf already. We had Bertha not too long ago, as a matter of fact, at the time of recording this video. So that's what we're seeing with our hurricane season in the El Nino. Now we need to pivot over to winter weather and talk about that as well, because things are getting interesting over there. And the winter weather I'm noticing in the United States, and I will talk about this more in depth in another video, is that things are not going to be as they seem across much of the U.S. So shifting over to the continental United States, let's go ahead and start with our main sea level pressure anomalies. Let's go ahead and go to October 2026. Definitely noticing those lower pressures than average across much of the southern United States and the western U.S. as well. Things are definitely getting interesting. You are seeing higher pressure over here close to Canada and the northern part of the United States. And as time continues to progress, and before we do, I do want to talk about this, because what this chart represents right here is across much of the western U.S. and across much of the southern parts of the U.S., especially in the, I'd say this part, which encompasses about 75% of the United States over here. You're definitely going to see more storm potential, more convection than average across much of the U.S., particularly on the West Coast as the Pineapple Express and as rainy season starts to ramp up going into November as well, and in parts of October. We saw this a little bit with the shear map in the tropics. You're noticing more of a low pressure system right here, and the reason I bring this up is because that could bring up your severe weather potential. As a matter of fact, if all the cards are played right, you have increased moisture, you have increased shear, you have decreased pressure. That is the recipe for more severe weather, at least at a synoptic scale, across parts of the southeastern United States starting in October. Let's go ahead and shift over to November. Around the same, albeit the pressures across the East Coast start to really calm down, and it remains pretty persistent across much of the United States. The northern part of the Midwest over here remains above average with the high pressure. That's a less stormy situation over there, not as much convection. As a matter of fact, maybe not as much lake effect snow from what I'm seeing with this higher pressure over here. Gonna want to pay attention to that moving forward. But in the West Coast, especially in the mountain regions, you're seeing that those lower pressures, you're seeing that Pineapple Express starting to ramp up. That could lead to more mountain snowfall for a lot of areas in Wyoming, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, those areas that are pretty much deep into the mountains starting in October going into November. And then December, things start to ramp up across much of the United States. You're seeing the two biggest areas in terms of your pressure mainly staying on the West Coast and the mountain regions and in the southern parts / mid-Atlantic over here. And the lowest anomaly, I would say, is also over here in Florida, which is telling me two things as well. Number one, Florida is going to get a lot of convection this winter from this El Nino across much of the state. And number two, this is more of a favorable pattern for stronger nor'easters. And what that will ultimately do is that could carry over, maybe develop off the east coast of the U.S., particularly around the Carolinas and Georgia, and then start shifting over and moving towards parts of the mid-Atlantic, parts of the northeastern U.S. as well, potentially bring pretty significant winds and significant snowfall to a lot of the coastal areas. And another thing I do want to emphasize is what this El Nino is going to ultimately do too, is what this El Nino is going to allow is for some of these nor'easters to shift over a bit further away from the coast, which on paper doesn't seem like you're going to get that many impacts. But what that would ultimately do is that rain-snow line that so many people on the East Coast are known for and they kind of pay attention to. I know a lot of people who are around that region, so they know what I'm talking about. And what that will ultimately do is shift further to the south, maybe putting areas like Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, the 5 big cities in that part of the United States, and further into the snow territory than what we've seen with the climatological mean. And January absolutely reinforces that, with the exception of what we're seeing maybe in New England over here. Across much of the United States, you're looking at much lower pressures than average, particularly concentrated in the deep south where nor'easters are more likely to form, and on the west coast with the Pineapple Express. That's really going to ramp up your rain totals and your snow totals in the mountains. But also look at the Midwest, particularly from Missouri to Ohio. Over here, typically it's not as much of a situation where you're seeing your lower pressures. It's not as stormy over there. Typically it's a bit more quiet during the winter going into January 2027, at least in past El Ninos. Now we're seeing a situation where we're looking at more storms than what we would originally think in that region. You're going to want to pay attention to that, especially as we get towards the cold anomalies and talk about those. Going into February, the East Coast absolutely gets below that average anomaly, 4.5 millibars below average. That's nor'easter heaven for a lot of these areas, and that it could be the recipe for a lot of snowfall, especially coastal snowfall, anywhere from Virginia all the way to Maine. You're going to want to take that very seriously. California, the Pineapple Express starts to decrease a little bit. In the Midwest, you're starting to see those higher pressures. And then as we go into March, it remains nor'easter heaven across much of the East Coast over here. So it's all things that we're going to want to pay attention to, and we'll continue to talk about more in depth. But I want to go ahead also and talk about our precip anomalies as well, just to kind of emphasize those. As we go into December right here, it kind of stays away from the Midwest. It plays a little bit of keep away in the Midwest. It mainly stays in California, Texas, the Deep South, particularly for severe weather season. But Florida just absolutely gets a lot of rainfall from this in general. And the East Coast gets a lot more precip than average. That's when your nor'easters are going to start ramping up across that part of the region. So it's definitely something you're going to want to pay attention to and take pretty seriously. Going into January, that situation just gets reinforced, and you're seeing less dry air across much of the Great Plains and the Midwestern United States. February is a bit more of a resurgence with that, but overall, the eastern coast of the United States and the western coast of the United States really starts to ramp up with this. And based on the fact that we're seeing a pretty significant super El Nino, you better believe impacts across much of these regions are going to be a bit more significant on top of the lower pressures. You're seeing lower pressures of around 4.5 degrees below the climatological mean in that part, coupled with increased moisture. Let's take a look at the cold anomalies as well. Let's take a quick gander at those. Taking a look at our temperature anomalies, things are getting interesting. In December of 2026, you're seeing above average anomalies with the exception outside of the deep south over here. January is a bit more mixed right here. Definitely a bit of a shift from what I've seen with previous models, but February is when the switch really flips right here, ladies and gentlemen. And taking a gander at things, this also creeps across much of the United States, California, all the way to New York. And that is also a situation that you're going to want to watch out for on the East Coast, because on top of those low pressures, on top of the moisture anomalies that we're seeing, on top of the temperature anomalies, that is nor'easter heaven for you guys, especially going into January and February 2027. And those are all things that we're going to want to watch out for, and we'll talk more about in depth at a later video. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and close it out right here. I hope you guys enjoyed the synopsis. Be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you are new. The goal, as always, is to get more people engaged with weather. Feel free to join the Storms United Discord server. The link to that will be in the end screen. And with that being said, have a wonderful day, guys. Stay safe.